Hello everybody, and welcome to Education Bite number 132, dated December 15th, 2020. I'm Walter, your mobile historian and blue-collar scholar. This Education Bite is entitled, The Importance of Context When Interpreting History. Far too many people interpret history without interpreting the context behind it. For those of you who are not aware of what context is, simply put, context describes the circumstances going on in the background which led to a particular event or idea coming to pass. Without understanding context, quite often it can be very difficult to accurately interpret historical events. Now, anyone who calls themselves a historian, this is obviously second nature, all right? Historians automatically use context when interpreting any piece of historical information, any event in history, to fully understand why it happened the way that it did. We must interpret context, okay? Most people, when they interpret history, just look at it and then make a judgment without fully understanding what's going on in the background, okay? They interpret history and make a judgment also erroneously by way of contemporary standards, okay? That is another fallacy, all right? Judging the past by contemporary standards, especially without using context, will almost always lead to erroneous conclusions. I can give you a few examples of this, okay? Supreme Court decision in Bowers versus Hardwick in 1986, all right? That decision effectively upheld Georgia's sodomy law, okay, thus restricting the private freedom, so to speak, of homosexual persons, okay, in their own dwellings, all right? Now, that decision obviously was not on a charitable level correct. The decision was a setback for the gay rights movement. But if you look at the context of what's going on in the background, you would probably see why the court ruled the way they did. In 1986, when the Bowers versus Hardwick decision was handed down, what was going on in the background? The AIDS epidemic, all right? It was still fairly new at that time, all right? And, it was very, very, very devastating to the country, all right? And thus that undoubtedly influenced the Supreme Court as well in reaching the conclusion that they did, all right? Not to suggest that the justices in any way were homophobic, we can hope that they weren't, but undoubtedly the AIDS epidemic, which was going on right around them, certainly influenced their decision. Of course, that decision was overturned in 2003 with the landmark decision of Lawrence versus Texas. Obviously, by 2003, the AIDS epidemic had been severely curtailed, by way of sex education and means of prevention, all right, spreading that virus, okay? And in 2003, obviously, the progress of the gay rights movement was certainly in a forward direction, leading to a much more progressive decision in Lawrence versus Texas, all right? Another example was the Supreme Court's decision in Terry versus Ohio, 1968, versus its decision in Miranda versus Arizona in 1966. In the context of Miranda in 1966, things were a lot calmer in the country, all right? And the Warren Court's decisions overall were very restrictive toward the abilities of law enforcement. And of course, in 1966, that was the quite ideal breeding ground for such anti-law enforcement and pro-criminal decisions, all right? But in the context of 1968, the country was a very different place from 1966. In 1968, okay, arguably, the anti-war movement against our involvement in Vietnam was at its height. Okay, there were significant amounts of protests with respect to segregation in housing and in other things. There, of course, civil rights movement going on in the background that has not stopped as of yet. Okay, so, you know, you've got lots of other things going on in the background. You've got a lot of social unrest, okay? You've got a lot of riots and other things, okay? Especially due to the assassination of Martin Luther King, all right? So you've got a whole lot more, you know, violent events going on in the background in 1968 versus in 1966, okay? So obviously context influenced the Supreme Court to rule in Terry versus Ohio that law enforcement essentially needed more liberty to be able to control social unrest and you know, ever rising rates of urban crime, versus in 1966 with Miranda, where they effectively restricted the abilities of law enforcement with the Miranda decision, requiring them to read people their rights under general circumstances when making arrests, all right, and planning to detain them, all right. So the country was a lot more socially unstable in 1968 versus in 1966. Okay, so the context easily shows you why it was a natural conclusion for the Supreme Court to rule the way it did in Terry versus Ohio in 68 versus what it did in Miranda versus Arizona in 1966. Okay, we had a lot of things going on in 68 that were not going on in 66, or were significantly lower in 66 versus 68. Okay, so context always, okay, influences why events happen, and only when you understand context can you truly understand why things in history happen the way that they did. Okay, so that is context, ladies and gentlemen. The circumstances going on in the background which influence the outcome of a particular event or an idea occurring. All right, you must understand it to understand history accurately. If you have any questions or controversies, please leave them down below and I'll be happy to answer them. Take care, stay safe out there, and I'll talk to you at the next Education Bite. Peace.